Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Just Onside. As always, I'm joined by Owais Ahmed. How are you, Owais?
I'm doing good, thanks, Ayub. Doing well this Tuesday evening. How about yourself?
All good, all good, all good. I had a visit to the south of France last week. Very hot, very nice.
South of
Uh,
France. That's where
Work
the
related, work related. It was not pleasure. It was purely work related.
I was gonna say that's where the rich folk go for their holidays, don't they?
There's always a wannabe rich man, and that was me. But
And
it was
just considering because I've always thought of South of France as a decent destination. What airline did you travel on?
it was a commercial airline on the way to France, but a private jet on the way back.
All right,
But
okay.
we are humble people. We are humble people. So
a
let's move
private
on.
a private jet, was it? Okay, good
Yeah,
stuff.
but let's move on. Let's
Moving on swiftly.
yes, yes. So let me first get out of the way the usual things. So please, please share the video with your friends. Smash a like. Uh, it really does help the channel. So if you could do that, that'd be absolutely fantastic. And I'd like to thank the viewers that we do have. I mean, we've got at the moment we've got 170 subscribers. We've got some regular viewers, so a shout out to those regular followers. Your support means everything to us. Okay, so do the usual good things. This episode, it's about a chap that maybe about 2 weeks ago was much vilified. He was considered to be one of those players that had maybe sort of wasting his career. A lot of people, if you asked about this chap, they'd probably sort of say he's lazy. He's somebody who had talent, who's wasting his talent. He's far too busy, maybe sort of being sidetracked by other things apart from playing football. But he did an interview last week, and following the interview, he's getting a tremendous amount of support. There's a great deal of empathy for this guy. Uh, I presume those who follow football know who I'm talking about. It's Dele Alli. So straight over to you, Oris. You've obviously watched the interview with Gary Neville. What's your thoughts? It was quite a candid interview, quite an open interview, quite an emotional interview. So what's your thoughts on Dele Alli and his experiences and where he's at this moment in time?
Yeah, and I think you used the word candid, and that's exactly what it was. Many observers and viewers of the overlap, which obviously, in terms of the interviews that they do on the overlap, obviously hosted by Gary Neville, it's normally quite fun, light-hearted entertainment. They've been taking the overlap on tour with Jamie Carragher, Roy Keane, and a few other guests joining in some of their live audiences. But they've travelled on the road, and it's quite fun and humorous. So it's in terms of the forum, and Gary Neville prefaces the introduction of the podcast by saying this was going to be a very different episode to what they'd previously put together. So I'd probably just like to give a little bit of context to what you're referring to in terms of the interview. I imagine many football observers and viewers will have watched the podcast. I watched it 3 times just to get a real in-depth flavor and making sure that I covered every last detail. So what was discussed, it was a sit-down interview with Dele Alli, as you mentioned, Ayub, with Gary Neville. It was about a 43, 44-minute piece. And in that episode, or in that sit-down interview, he discusses some of the challenges he's been facing in recent times, especially with regards to addiction. But he also opens up quite candidly about some of the trauma and abuse he'd suffered in terms of his upbringing, especially in his early formative years until the age of 12 when he was adopted by his adopted family. Now, what I didn't, the reason why I wanted to watch it multiple times is because when I was informed by a colleague at work that, hey, have you watched the Dele Alli interview on the overlap or some real interesting bits? It was at that moment I thought, oh, that's interesting. Dele Alli, somebody who clearly is a lot of people, a lot of football viewers have thought about Dele Alli's situation in terms of what's happened to him. This is a player who played obviously for Milton Keynes early on, got this big move to I think Spurs in 2015, scored I think 51 times for Spurs in a 7-year career. Fell out of favour at the back end of his Spurs career, went to Everton. But this is a player who'd represented England over 30 times, played for England at the World Cup in 2018. So it's a player who you thought is going to go on to have a strong and illustrious career. And it's obviously gone sideways very quickly. And I can't think of many players who have genuinely, like in terms of their performances and standards, and yet has gone down so quickly. I mean, yes, you could talk about maybe Eden Hazard at Real Madrid, but he'd had an incredibly strong, especially his performances at Lille and Chelsea and for Belgium, where he put together a number of years where he was arguably like a top 5, top 10 player in the world. So this is somebody who's still incredibly young at that time, and yet suddenly his career took a little bit of a nosedive. So he talks about how. And I don't, like I said, I don't want to really get too much into the personal stuff, because I think you've got to be mindful about covering some of the details. He's obviously shared those on the podcast, and it's not for me to critique or observe or give my thoughts on that. But I think for the purposes of being informative to our viewers who may not have watched the podcast, essentially he talks about how I think he took up smoking at 6. Or I should say, let me rephrase. He talks about how he was molested by his mother's friend at the house at the age of 6. He talks about how he was sent to Africa at the age of 7 to learn discipline. These are his words. He was then sent back after about 6 months. He took up smoking at 8, started dealing drugs around the same time. I think he also spoke about how he was hung off a bridge at the age of 11 by somebody off the next estate and what have you. And then it was only at the age of 12 when he was, so to speak, given up for adoption and was adopted by a family who he speaks quite glowingly of during the podcast. So he's covered a lot of mental trauma. He's also then spoken about how in recent times he's developed an addiction to sleeping tablets. With a view, and I do want to quote him accurately, I think with a view to helping him cope with the mental side of not just what football brings in terms of its challenges, but also maybe perhaps some of the personal challenges that he was doing his best to suppress, let's say. So recently, he, I think as of 3 weeks before the podcast or before the interview took place, he'd attended a mental rehab facility in America where he spent 6 weeks, mainly to kind of work on some of the childhood trauma that I've just kind of outlined, but also just to kind of improve his kind of mental well-being and his mental health, and to kind of understand himself a little bit better as well. And I think he again speaks very well of the rehab facility, that the time he spent there. So he spent 6 weeks there. He's now back at Everton. He's got an injury currently, but I think it's one that he'll be over in the next couple of weeks and should be back to full health. And he's obviously hoping to see how he can go on from here. So that's kind of, I just wanted to lay that out in terms of what was discussed, and obviously some quite striking claims and kind of details being shared there by Dele Alli. Gary Neville obviously was, as you can imagine, visibly taken aback on more than one occasion. So just for our viewers and just for our listeners who may not have watched the video, that's kind of what was outlined. I'd like to maybe just get your thoughts. So you've obviously, I imagine, watched it a few times as well. We've now covered obviously what was discussed on the whole. There's obviously a few other points about, you mentioned that word lazy. He talks about how Mourinho called him lazy and then thereafter was apologized in a one-on-one session. It was obviously picked up in the Amazon documentary about him being called lazy, but not necessarily the apology from Mourinho. But we can get into some of the details later. What was your overall kind of view of the piece itself? Because I think that's something I've got some thoughts on as well, for sure. But generally, obviously, what you heard from Dele Alli.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, we used the word candid, and it was candid. It was very open. It was, and you could sort of see that the anguish that he had and the difficulties that he had. I mean, at one stage, obviously, he did sort of break down, which sort of Gary Neville. I mean, tremendous kudos to Gary Neville. I think it was a really, really good interview. And it's not something which I presume comes naturally to Gary Neville. He's not a natural broadcaster. He's become an excellent broadcaster. So he dealt with it fantastically. He got the information out. He was delicate. He was sensitive. and he was obviously somebody that I think Dele Alli knows from England. So
Yeah.
I think it was a in terms of just an interview, it was a good interview. I think it was quite an emotional interview. But what I would like to do first is I think sometimes it's always good to outline the position that you come from because it gives context. I mean, I always say that if somebody is interviewing a politician, it would be nice to know what your position is, what your politics are, which then gives context. I must confess, I'm quite old school in terms of uh, attitudes, in terms of how sort of men should be. I mean, I'm going to use or I'm going to sort of refer to a guy which is at the moment he's quite a he divides opinion at this moment in time, Andrew Tate. Uh, and I wouldn't sort of say I'm a complete subscriber of Andrew Tate. I've got my own views and my own opinions, but I must confess I'm somebody that has been brought up to be quite strong, but to have context as well. That sometimes your situation, what you have to try and do is not be purely individualistic, but look at the wider context. So if I'm in a situation, a difficult situation, I've been brought up to think, well, there are other people perhaps in a worse situation. Also, the faith as well. I suppose everybody is a product of their experiences, their environment, their culture. If they're of a religious disposition, that has an influence as well. So I'm one that doesn't always focus on the self. I tend to focus on the collective. So uh, my initial views were that I mean I must confess, I mean I was moved by his experiences because I've certainly not been through the experiences that he's had. I mean he to be sexually molested at 6, uh, to have an alcoholic mother, to have a father who doesn't really care too much for him, to have quite a turbulent and volatile lifestyle. It must have an impact. What I absolutely give him praise for is that from the upbringing that he had, from 12 to 16. At 16, I think he made his debut for MK
Correct.
Dons. At 19, he was an unbelievably talented and gifted footballer. So amidst the chaos and the carnage in his life, he somehow has been able to compartmentalize what's happened, focus on football. I mean, that was the one thing with the interview. They didn't talk too much as to how he developed into this great player.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think just on that, I didn't want to interrupt you because just on that, if you remember, Gary Neville speaks about how the two times in his life, mainly kind of when Pochettino was coach, so that's more recent times, he was talking
mm,
about this mentorship, this kind of stability. So he was saying, is that he posed the question to Delhi, is this when you feel like you're at your best, when you have this kind of mentor and stability? He talks about the two times. One is when obviously Poch was head coach at Spurs, obviously when Delhi was coming through, especially when Poch was giving a lot of youngsters, in a sense, that kind of ability to establish themselves in the first team. And secondly, Gary Neville poses it about when he joins his or when he's adopted by his adopted family, in terms of those 3-4
mm.
years between 12 and 16, I imagine. And I think Delhi speaks about how that was the time when he started to get himself involved in terms of schoolboy football and what have you. So you're right, they didn't touch on it in too much detail, but there's a hint in amongst the interview that that's when at least this kind of footballing journey began, when he had a little bit of stability with his new family, let's say.
And it must have worked wonderfully well because he was extremely precautious. As I said, to make his debut at 16, and sometimes the transition between being a League One player and then moving to the Premier League is quite difficult. It's quite challenging. I can't think of many players, top of my head, who've made that transition so smoothly. And he was one. He was just unbelievable. I think he had everything. I mean, Gary Neville alluded to the fact that he was almost Brian Robson-esque, Keane-esque, and these are absolute icons of British football. So he'd obviously found a way of nurturing the talent that he had, develop into a fantastic footballer. So that's where it for me, he's obviously got to a position where he's a fantastic footballer. Now, this is where I can't look at just Dele Alli and the circumstances that he's in. What I have to always do, it goes back again to the way that I am as a human being, because mine is always never always focused on the self, focus on the collective. So when he talks about his issues, immediately I'm thinking that he's had tremendous trauma But he's obviously got into a position where he's got extremely loving adoptive parents from 12 onwards. He's got a very supportive environment. He's obviously successful, so he is popular, because you know that if you're good at sports or good at something, it does draw tremendous popularity. So he's able to navigate the difficult waters that he's had. He's in a position now where he's in a stable environment. He's in a stable home. He's doing well. He's getting success. He's obviously become a professional footballer, which you know is tremendous. I mean, there's tremendous adulation with being a tremendous with being a footballer. He's got a move to Spurs, a Premier League footballer at 19. So everything seems fantastic. It almost sort of seems that I would sort of say that from where he started and the difficulties that he's had to where he is now at 19, how can you? I mean, that is unbelievable. It's then, I suppose, after about 3 or 4 years, it's the last 2 or 3 years where really his career's gone off the rails. Now, I can understand. I mean, I think from the interview, if you've got any intelligence, you know that maybe those demons were he was suppressing those demons. Those demons have come to the surface. Now it's got to the point where I suppose if you're living on sleeping pills, it has to affect everything that you do. And I suppose maybe that's the reason why his performance were affected, because if you're popping pill after pill after pill, and he didn't quite tell Gary Neville how many, but he did allude to the fact that he was taking far too many. So I have empathy for Dele Alli, but my feelings are that there's children in Syria who've had their parents shot at a young age. They're orphans. Where's the outpouring of support and empathy for those? For Iraq, for Palestinians, and that's where maybe it's difficult for me to have complete empathy for Dele Alli. He has a fantastic life. He has tremendous amounts of money. He has lots of advisors. If you notice when he came in, he alluded to the point that his team have advised that they do this interview now, because I think one of the tabloids has found out that he was in America,
right.
So maybe he wants to get the story out first. So he has a support network. So I do empathize. I do feel that he obviously has considerable demons that he's having to deal with. But again, it's the upbringing that I've had, that I've always been advised that you put context into whatever happens in your life. If you're in a difficult situation, try and look at it from the point of view that are other people in a situation worse off than yours. Now, that shouldn't always be an automatic, well, because there's people worse off, I should feel okay. But it gives me context. It gives me context. There are people who are homeless. There are people with serious illnesses. So I always use that as my yardstick in terms of where I'm at. Now, this is obviously how I sort of live my life. Andrew Tate obviously talks about masculinity, being a man, sort of not always at the first sign of some sort of discomfort to say, well, look, it's something which is too much. I need to talk about it. I do subscribe slightly to that philosophy as well, that I think what in the West we have almost become very, very selfish, that we're always focusing on ourselves rather than looking at maybe, I suppose, the worldwide picture, that there are other people in difficult situations. Be grateful for what you have. So that's the stance that I have, that I'm certainly empathetic to the situation that he's in. But I think there are people who are in a extremely or far more worse position than Dele Alli. Do they get the same amount of support? Do they get the same amount of empathy? I don't think they do. And that's where I would say to Dele Alli that maybe, perhaps, it may be important to think of it in those terms, that think of it in terms of context, in terms of worldwide, in terms of that, irrespective of the difficulties that you've had, you've done fantastically well. I mean, as I said, I cannot commend him enough to be able to be a professional footballer for a Premier League club at 19, based on the circumstances and the upbringing that he's had. So in absolutely no way, what he's accomplished is, to me, is incredible. In terms of sympathy, in terms of empathy, mine is a little bit tempered, because I'd certainly say, yes, I think you've had a difficult time. Maybe it is time for you to try and address these issues. But I think, in a sense, it's quite selfish. I think he's very insular, and I think it's almost a cancer that affects, I think, predominantly Western society, that we've become very insular. We look at ourselves. We don't tend to sort of put context to situations. So I'm more of the opinion that perhaps we're giving him too much airtime. We're pandering to his situation. When there are other people in far worse situations who won't get any coverage, any support, any sympathy because they're not famous footballers.
I think some really interesting points there from you, Ayub. Very insightful. And just to confirm, we've obviously not discussed this topic whatsoever. So I'm hearing obviously your views for the first time as well, and I will cover your points kind of in detail if I can, if that's okay. So you mentioned obviously his team. Now, just for a bit of context, it's at the start of the interview, and Gary Neville is introducing the interview, the kind of context behind the interview and what have you. And it's Gary Neville who actually references the mention of Dele and his team had got in touch with Gary Neville and the team there overlapped to put this interview together. Now, the reasons given are that the tabloids had, as you rightly mentioned, had established what he was doing in America in terms of getting himself the help at the mental health facility and what have you, or the rehab facility. So due to the fact that the tabloids were leaking stories or about to leak stories, Dele and his team, I imagine, reading between the lines, wanted to kind of get ahead of the story and put their version of the story across. And I think that's fair. I think that's fine. I get that you may wish to control the narrative much better than the tabloids. And obviously, Gary Neville alludes to this throughout the interview that Dele's quite skeptical of the media. They've not necessarily been, let's say, so kind to him. Some may say that's warranted. Some may say some of it has been over the top. I'm not here to kind of discuss that, but that's obviously what Dele and his team are thinking. So yeah, whenever you hear about a footballer and his team, I think the most viewers feel like, okay, this is obviously some orchestrated effort to get their side of the story across, and PR comes into it and what have you. I think in terms of trauma, what I would say is in terms of your point about the fact that there are people worse off, absolutely. There always is, whether that's a community, whether that's a war-torn country, or what have you, orphans, all the rest of it. And again, I agree. I think the only thing I would say, I think trauma is subjective. One may feel, obviously, and I think he alludes to that. And I think where I think did himself justice in the interview is where multiple times during the interview he talks about how he does not want anyone to feel sorry for him. It's not something he accepts easily. He doesn't want any sympathy. I can only go off his words. You might argue, well, the whole piece is about to evoke a lot of sympathy, and I get that. It's one thing saying, but I guess I see better than I hear, so to speak. So in the end, one can question the overall merit of the piece, and I think my slight cynicism. And one of the reasons we put this podcast together was so that we could be authentic in our views. My slight cynicism, and you touched on it, is Dele Alli today more likely to get greater opportunities to continue a career in top flight football today than he was prior to the release of the interview? Now, I would argue that 100% he is. You've seen the outpouring of love and emotion and sentiment towards him. It's a feel-good story for the nation in the sense of not necessarily the facts that were divulged. Of course, those were harrowing, but it's a case of as a community wanting to put our arms around Dele. And I'm all for people getting help. If you remember my comments about Ivan Toney's ban, I said I'm all for his second chances. I'm all for him receiving the support he needs with his gambling addiction. But that ban was far too lenient. They are two separate discussion points. And it's the same here. There's a part of me that's a little cynical to think this player was in somewhat of a last chance saloon, if we can say that. And yet, over one 45-minute kind of broadcast with Gary Neville, there's definitely going to be more inclination for clubs and the wider footballing fraternity to give him multiple opportunities to continue forging a well-established footballing career. And the reason I feel that way is because I've seen this happen in many sports. I'm not going to recount all the instances because they're not necessarily all in football, but I've seen this card played multiple times. And that's where my cynicism comes. Because in one full swoop, and Gary Neville wasn't there to challenge any of the points made. Similarly, when we hear the comments about what happened to him at the age of 6, perhaps my time and experience in my legal background, what have you, I always think, well, fine, that's obviously a subjective side of Dele's viewpoints of what happened to him. Let's hear from his mother, his birth mother, who's since come out and suggested she didn't know anything happened. Again, I'm not here to determine who's telling the truth. What I'm saying is we have to be able to give all parties in this story a voice. And that's not something maybe that's afforded to those who are not in the public eye like Dele Alli is, in terms of his kind of family and friends who can also maybe perhaps corroborate his version of events or support his version of events or dispute his version of events. All I'm saying is let's be fair. Let's hear all sides of the story. So I think that's where I come from. In the end, what I would say is on the overall piece, Ayub, in my opinion, I think he speaks very well. I think he does not blame, like I said, it says it multiple times. He doesn't blame Mourinho. He doesn't blame kind of any of those around him. He doesn't blame his mother. He understands some of the situations that she found herself in. I want to believe him in terms of the fact that this is just a genuine piece that he feels ready to talk about. And I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt overall, mainly because I think over watching it 3 times, I just sense that this is somebody in the end who needs to tackle this head on, went to rehab to get himself better, and now simply wanted to put his version of the story across, which everyone has the right to do so. So in the end, I conclude that I would want him to get better. I would want him to resurrect his footballing career. I think, again, he's got a better chance today than he did before this piece with Gary Neville. The only point I will say just very quickly before I turn it back to you is, what does the future hold for Dele Alli? And I think it's going to be very challenging for him. And it's for one reason and one reason only. I have that much reverence for the game of football and for sport in general, that it's such a difficult sport. It's such a difficult endeavor at the highest level, especially at professional sports, where if you lose a couple of years at the highest level, the game moves on so incredibly quick that it's hard to simply just say, I'm going to get back and I'm going to be the best player I can be. If you remember when Gary puts it to him about his hopes and prospects, he talks about not necessarily getting back to the level he was at, but he talks about how he wants to be a better player than he was even previously. And it's the same reason why I didn't count those points when you and Badge wanted me to count those points for Arsenal, in terms of they threw it away. And I said, no, I've got too much reverence for the game. You've got to earn it. It's not just handed to you as if, oh, I've been that player before, I can be that player again. Just because something's happened in the past doesn't necessarily mean, in a sport that evolves year in, year out, that he can get back to the highest level. I wish him well. I'd love for this to be a real feel-good story where he gets back, establishes himself in the Premier League, and goes on to do well, because I think he is hurting and I think he does want to clearly get better. But again, there's always that little bit of cynicism in you that, again, it wasn't a piece that Gary was going to challenge him on. It was simply just a sympathetic kind of shoulder to for him to share. And I think that's appropriate given he's only 2-3 weeks removed from mental health or the rehab facility kind of stint. So wish him well. That's the overall sentiment. I believe him in terms of his version of the experiences that he's had. But there is this kind of balance as well to say, well, you know, sometimes it's just, you're not entirely sure how things are put together and put across. It was a piece that was intended to evoke sympathy, and that's what it's done from the wider footballing fraternity.
Well put. And his team have done a great job. You mentioned maybe there's a cynicism there. I'm pretty certain that his team obviously have been very calculating, and I think it is because he was on his last chance saloon, and this is an opportunity that I think he will be afforded now. I'm intrigued to find out, because I from a purely footballing point of view, I mean, my wish is to see Dele Alli, the player that I saw a few years ago, because I think he was an outstanding football player. In terms of, because he's going to get every ground that he plays at, he's going to get opportunities now. I think with Everton, they're going to do everything in their powers to try and perhaps provide support, give him some sort of game time, get him fit, match fit. He talked quite highly of Sean Dyche as well at Everton. I think Everton Football Club have been very supportive of him.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued to sort of find out when he first sort of plays at what level. You're right. This is a game that every single year the standard it goes up a notch. He's had 2.5 years where he's obviously not played to a high level. His ability has been quite affected. I presume now. I mean, he's mentioned that he's been on sleeping tablets, and he's popping these pills from 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. So maybe it has to have an impact. You can't take those things and still be fully functional. So I hope he gets back to his absolute best. And I like the fact he did say that he just doesn't want to get back to what he was. He wants to get better, which was good to hear. And I think in there is a drive, because if he's become a professional footballer at 16 at MK Dons, considering the background that he has, that there's an inner strength there somewhere. So I certainly think he's a strong enough character, albeit he's, I suppose, shown great weakness, or at least apparent weakness and openness. So I think he has the strength of character. So I'm purely focused on his football. I wouldn't be if I was at a stadium. I won't be giving him, because I presume at every ground that he goes to, he'll get a great round of applause, great support. I perhaps wouldn't afford him that, because, as I said, my context always is worldwide. I'm not just looking at the individual. I think he's been, albeit there's lots of traumas, he's been quite fortunate. In a sense, his talent has afforded him that good fortune. He had some wonderful adoptive parents. So there's been a lot of good things that have happened in his life. In fact, there's been things that have happened in his life that a lot of us are envious of. So he's earned it. He's not been made a professional footballer. He's worked at it, but he's had quite a good life. So I want him to be a really good footballer again. The 45 minutes, I think, in my mind, was a great exercise by his team. You alluded to it, that you've seen it in the past where maybe a professional sportsman perhaps has certain issues. They preempt maybe any negative criticisms by doing something like this, and it's worked. I mean, I've looked at all the comments. I mean, there's thousands upon thousands of complimentary comments and supportive comments. Anybody who dares to criticize is absolutely slaughtered on the comments. So certainly he's won the hearts and minds of the British public. I'm sure worldwide as well. He'll be, if it's featured worldwide, he'll have affection and support from people elsewhere as well. So to maybe just sort of finish on what my views are, I'm going back to what I said at the start, old school. There are times when maybe, I suppose, there's lots of difficulties in your life. There's various ways to deal with it. I've been brought up to put context always, that there are people worse off. There are difficult times, and maybe sometimes you do need to seek support. But this is almost, in my opinion, where it's a society that's gone wrong, that it's all about me, me, me. Even though he alluded to a lot of times that he was reluctant to disclose. So he certainly said always that he didn't really share the difficulties that he's had. But in my mind, I'm sort of thinking that maybe there was a perspective in your life. Maybe you didn't appreciate the good fortune that you had with wonderful adoptive parents. Maybe you didn't appreciate the fact that you'd accomplished something that very few do. That is becoming a professional footballer. You became a Spurs player at 19. You played for England. These are things that, irrespective of what's perhaps happened in the past, certainly should cushion any trauma, or at least minimize the effects of the trauma. So that's my position, as I said. All fully behind Dele Alli trying to resurrect his career, but I'm not going to give him that amount of support as maybe others will do.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. It's your subjective take, and I think, look, I can understand it. And the only final point that I want to make, Ayub, just so that we maybe finish this topic in the right way, is that I think we both would accept, or at least, I mean, for sure, I can speak for myself, that there are challenges with kind of mental health that occur, and you've got to find a way through support of friends, family, and what have you to do the best you can. But the reason why I am really intrigued by this topic currently, especially at high level sports, and I follow a lot of other sports as well and what have you, is and I'm going to detail one particular situation to just give a context as to why I feel the way I feel, is there was a situation recently in the NBA where you had an elite player, I'm talking a top 10 player in the league, a young player, incredibly rich, incredibly wealthy, attend a nightclub slash strip club and what have you, and he was brandishing a gun in the club, and based off that, he was kind of, let's not say suspended, but he was taken out of the kind of headlines and what have you. And the league was looking to deal with it. A video surfaced of him brandishing a gun and what have you. And it emerged shortly thereafterwards with a statement that the player put out, was that he needs to work on how to deal with some of the mental stress and what have you, et cetera, et cetera. And after that piece, the wider basketball fraternity, especially the media, were like, he needs to get himself well, he needs to get himself right, let's give him more love and support. He did a sit-down interview with an NBA reporter or analyst at the time, Jalen Rose, and he sits down and he talks about how, yes, I need to do better and some of my mental challenges. They were just powder puff questions treated in an incredibly delicate way. And it reversed the entire narrative in one full swoop, this kind of mental health card. Less than 4 weeks later, or 6 weeks later, he was caught brandishing a gun in a car with his friends. It embarrassed the entire league, because at the time, there were many people during the first incident, when it was being reported and exposed, that were quite skeptical. But because mental health is such a serious topic, and it's not something you can necessarily touch and quantify. It's inside a person's mind and feelings and emotions, and it exists and it's true. But I have so much respect for those, or so much kind of sympathy for those who truly go through mental struggles, that all of a sudden I've seen it in high-level sports, that it's the first card played when you're looking to change a narrative, especially when a player or participant in said sport is being exposed in any which way, in terms of their weakness, in terms of down performance, in terms of a negative incident, but off the field, off the court, whatever it may be. And that's where I'm coming from. I've seen it in multiple different situations where it's used, that card is used. The entire media fraternity will then be hands off, because it's not something people want to call people up on it. And what have you. It only was that in that incident that it happened again within 4 weeks, where we were like, right, we're going to have to deal with this. Clearly, he wasn't as contrite as he should be. Now, that's not to say people can't relapse, but that's my point. It's just, you sometimes, especially in the football world, where there's a lot of money and a lot of PR, and there's teams and there's media teams and all the rest, there's so much to it, public persona and perception and image, that you just sometimes, it's not a case that you don't believe them. It's just more of a case of you don't know what to believe. So you keep more of a neutral point of view to say, look, wish the guy well, want him to get better, him or her. But for me, to your point, what you said, and I think that's been your main kind of point throughout, is expecting me subjectively to have a whole ton of sympathy would need me, if I'm fair, to know the entire facts of the story. And that means hearing from all involved, not just one relatively orchestrated sit-down interview by one side of the story. What he's going through, I'm sure, is real for him. We wish him well. But that's my kind of, I'm just a little kind of arm's length whilst wishing him well, because I just have to be fair to the overall situation and everyone else involved.
Well, that's our view. I'll leave it up to the viewers now. If you can comment on this, because it is quite a emotional subject, in the sense, because it is talking about emotion, Dele Alli's emotion. So we'd love to hear what you think. Do you agree with what we've said, or what I've said, what Lewis has said? Do you disagree with us? Do you think we're being quite harsh? So please put your comments in. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are, because it's a heavy topic. It's a serious topic. Right. On to slightly lighter matters, Lewis. That's quite demanding, that chat that we just had. So we'll on to happy news. The San Francisco 49ers. No. Let's move on. This is I've been told not to talk about the
No, no, no,
championship.
no. Come
All
on,
right,
come
okay.
on.
Indulge me, indulge me. Why not?
Well, look. I mean, just let me set you up. Let me tee you up. I mean, we've got there was a sit-down interview Sky Sports did with, I think Sky Sports did with Rodri Zani, the former owner. He had 56% ownership remaining within Leeds. He's now sold that, I believe, to the 49ers group, which we've spoken about in previous podcasts, was always in the offing. I think they had to complete the deal before January next year. They've proceeded to take that over. There's a few famous people also in the group. I think I read today Michael Phelps,
Yeah, Michael Phelps as well.
Jordan Spieth, Justin Thomas as well, the golfer. I think Ricky Fowler pulled out. Smart fella. What's your thoughts? You've got a new ownership group. Obviously, they didn't want to be in the relegation. I think the overall valuation of the club was 170 million, I believe. Is it a happy day as a Leeds fan?
It certainly is. It certainly is. I mean, we've been cursed with poor ownership. Albeit with the last owner, we did get promoted, but that was to do with Bielsa rather than the owner and the way that he ran the football club. My confidence is that this is the 49ers. We're talking about an entity that is established. The chairman, who's going to be Parag Marat, he's been with the 49ers for 20 odd years, so he's got considerable amount of experience. The investors, I think it's more there. Michael Phelps, Jordan Spieth, these are, I mean, this is, I don't know whether it's an American model, but it adds credibility. Plus, what it does is commercially, it's always great to have these guys on board. So I think they're certainly looking at it from a commercial point of view, but certainly from the early murmurings that I've heard from the new owner, his intention is to get Leeds back into the Premier League, which I'm sure every owner would say that, but I think genuinely he's aware that Leeds is a one-city club. There is a lot of potential. We've already made a signing, or at least we're in the cusp of making a signing, a Chelsea young player, by all accounts, a really good player with a lot of promise for 7 million, which is, I spoke to my Chelsea supporting son, who does say that it's a really good value. He's a decent player, he's a good player. So
was that Ethan Ampadu?
that's the one.
Yeah, okay.
That's the one.
Longest serving Chelsea player or something?
No, I didn't say longest serving, did I?
No, I think he is the longest serving Chelsea player.
Oh, is he? Okay.
He's been at the club for like forever, I believe.
Oh, right. Okay.
But
Okay.
I think I read that. But go on, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. So it's all at the moment. I mean, we've only got about 3 weeks left, so we've got to get a real wriggle on. We've got a decent manager, Daniel Farke. He's 2 promotions in 3 years, or 3 seasons. So certainly the pedigree is there. It looks as if he's going to get back in. So I'm certainly, over the last few days, I've been more focused on that. So I've not been able to focus on what's been happening in terms of Premier League transfers, which I'm sure you're going to avail our viewers to what's been happening. So what has been happening in the transfer world, Lewis?
Well, you kept that to less than 2 minutes, so I'm impressed, Ayub. That's the last 2 minutes of Leeds exposure for the next 12 months. So enjoy it
until we become a Premier League club again.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
God willing.
God willing, yes, indeed. Yeah, I think. Look, we're just going to cover a couple of storylines in the transfer specials or the transfer stories of the summer. Definitely hotting up a little, in my opinion. I think there's a couple of things about to perhaps happen. Yes, we've had Declan Rice finally join Arsenal. He's joined the team out there in the US on their preseason tour. Jurriën Timber has also joined. These were deals already done. There were the last few bits and bobs that were being finalised. Arsenal so far having had a very strong window, at least in terms of the incomings. Again, the proof will be in the pudding once the season starts. The story I still want to discuss with you, Ayub, is, just very quickly, if I can, is the Harry Kane one. Because I still believe, and I don't know why it makes me giddy, this story, but it's more fascinating because, look, he is arguably the most, well, not arguably, he is the most iconic English player, and arguably, well, definitely one of the faces of the Premier League. And it's interesting, over the last week or so, there's been a little bit more coming out. Daniel Levy has engaged in conversations and talks with Bayern Munich. It was funny when this was reported, the very next sentence to come out was, "This does not mean in any way, shape or form that Spurs want to sell him." So I'm thinking, well, why is he speaking to Bayern Munich then? I mean, I don't get it. But and then there was and I think he still has some role within the club. Uli Hoeneß spoke about how he believes, and you can see clearly there's a bit of trepidation from Bayern Munich, but they believe that if Harry Kane does not change his mind, he will join them. So there's clearly been conversations had between Kane and Bayern, and I don't think that's perhaps frustrating for Daniel Levy when he views Harry Kane, but it's perhaps frustrating that he's having this played out in public a little bit. And I think Bayern Munich did speak about, or there's some rumours that they're not necessarily happy with Uli Hoeneß in terms of him putting that out there. The fact that they've openly discussed with Harry Kane and what have you. Tuchel hasn't necessarily dismissed the story. And I do want to get your thoughts, but what do we know about this story? Well, Harry Kane's playing for Spurs right now in pre-season. He could put this story to bed, but clearly he's weighing up his options. I think that much is not conjecture. I think that's pretty much fact. He could put this to bed and say, I'll be at Spurs for the 2023-2024 season. Done. But he's not. So the question is, what are his most likely scenarios? And I'm going to ask you one of four options. I'm going to give you four options, and I just want you to nail your opinion to one of them. Option number one is that he spends the 2023-2024 season at Spurs, but he does not renew his contract, which means that he would be available to agree any future arrangement with a European club from January onwards, and could walk away on a free in the summer next season. He stays at Spurs this season, but also signs a new contract. That's option number two, thereby pretty much committing the rest of his peak years at Spurs Football Club, you would imagine. Thirdly, he leaves Spurs this summer and moves to a club in the Premier League. Or fourth, he leaves Spurs this summer and moves to a club abroad. Right now, gun to your head, which one of those options are you taking? Or do you think, not which one he should, but do you think will materialise?
Number three.
You think he stays within the Premier League, but at a club other than Spurs?
Yeah, he's going to stay. I've said this, I think 2 or 3 times. He is a selfish footballer in the sense that he's very obsessed with the record, goal scoring in the Premier League, and I don't know how far away he is from. Is it Shearer?
47, 47 goals away from tying, 48 to break.
Yeah, so that's maybe sort of 2.5 seasons. So I that is a legacy, obviously, that I think will be difficult to break. So he knows that if he was to accomplish that, it's probably going to be, I don't know if he is broken, it's going to be miraculous, because it in terms of players staying in the Premier League for that length of time, it's not something that's going to happen. So I genuinely think that it's something that is very important to him, being goal scoring, but being not just being a goal scorer, but having records as a goal scorer. I mean, I almost think that overrides his desire to win trophies. I want him to prove me wrong, because as a sportsman, there is nothing worse for me than a sportsman being selfish, purely driven for personal records rather than winning trophies. Trophies is ultimately what a sportsman should be his motivation, especially if you're a good sportsman. Now, maybe if you're a run-of-the-mill sportsman, it's slightly different. But for Harry Kane to be at the age that he's at, to have, has he got any trophies?
No.
There you go. To be at that age, to have no trophies. I mean, he reminds me of Shearer. I mean, Shearer is another player that I very seldom speak in glowing terms for that reason alone. Again, he was selfish. All he was concerned about.
He won the Premier League with Blackburn Rovers.
He did, yes. I think he won an FA Cup as well, didn't he? But is that a player of that ilk, of that quality? Do you reckon that's satisfactory? And bearing in mind, he was courted by Manchester United, so he had an opportunity to play for a team and will win multiple trophies.
Yes, but 2 things. One, I'm pretty sure I'd have to check the stats. I don't think he won the FA Cup. And secondly, if you remember when he joined Newcastle, they were pretty much right there in terms of competing. Now, they weren't Manchester United, And obviously, he famously speaks on the overlap to Gary Neville about how he rejected Ferguson multiple times, and there's some funny stories about how he did it and what have you. I would encourage anyone to watch, but I'm not so sure. Newcastle weren't that far away, actually, if you look at where they were prior to the season that he joined. It's his boyhood club. That's where he grew up. That's what he knew. He'd spent quite a bit of time away from Newcastle, Southampton, Blackburn Rovers. So I could understand the lure of coming back home and playing in front of the Gallagher as he speaks about. I mean, you're obviously saying he's going to stay in the Premier League, so you must believe that it's got to be Manchester United this summer.
Only if this ownership business is resolved quickly. I presume it needs to be the Middle Eastern consortium or whoever is obviously putting in bids. But I just don't think. I think it's who is it at the moment? Is it Jim Ratcliffe?
Well, no, we don't know. It's going to be between Jim Ratcliffe, it seems, head of Ineos, or the Qatari family.
If it's the Qataris, he signs for Manchester United. If it's Ratcliffe, I'm not too sure.
Well, let's see. It's an interesting one, and I think it's one that's got some legs in it. I have long been consistent on this one. It's going to take Harry Kane to make it a little bit messy, in my opinion. And I think Daniel Levy requires that for him to get this deal over the line. There are some, and this is the game that Bayern Munich are playing in terms of this kind of game of chicken. There are some who believe that in the end, Daniel Levy will not want his player to leave on a free, regardless of these talks in the press about him not wanting to sell to a Premier League club at any cost, and he's willing to let him run his contract down to avoid selling him to a Premier League club. So basically letting Kane make that choice if he so wishes when he's a contractual free agent to do so. I think what Bayern Munich are saying is, well, look, this is the offer on the table and this is your last chance to cash in on a world-class striker. So it'll be very interesting to see how it goes. I think if Harry Kane puts something out there, I think what's happened is an arrangement between the player and the Supremo, Daniel Levy in this case, where, look, fine, keep your head down. We'll see what we can do for you. I think that's what I read between the lines. I'm just not so sure that this is going to come about unless Harry Kane, as I've used the phrase before, burns that bridge down to the ground. And I think that's unfortunate what it's going to take. But look, that for me is still arguably the most fascinating story. I'm really interested to see. It's a bit of a crossroads situation. Just wanted to get your thoughts. A couple of other Premiership stories. Andre Onana, we've spoken about him in previous podcasts. He looks to be sealing a deal to become the Manchester United #1 goalkeeper for a deal worth around 43 million. I was talking to someone at work today, and I said that in the modern day game, especially in the Premier League, but also in the Champions League, I would argue that the #1 quality that I'm looking for in a goalkeeper, and excuse my vulgar language when I say this, but is a set of big ones. And that's what you need. And what I mean by that is someone who's...
I know what you mean. I know what you mean by that.
I'm sure you do. It's not so... Listen, if you're a professional footballer at the highest level, you can all make the saves. Now, there'll be some goalkeepers who've got a little bit better footwork and being able to get to certain situations better, understanding how to close angles down a little bit better reflex is fine. But at the highest level, there's percentage. There's not much. What differentiates them is, as I mentioned, that level of confidence. And that's where football is going now, in terms of all 11 players have to be comfortable with the ball at their feet, especially the goalkeeper. And I think that's what Erik ten Hag's obviously decided and chosen by moving on from David De Gea and getting Andre Onana in, a goalkeeper he knows really well. I think it's a brilliant signing for Manchester United. If I was a Man United fan, I'd be comfortable in the end if he makes mistakes. The key thing is when he does make the odd mistake, which every goalkeeper will, it's not unique to him, that they support him, get behind it, understand that in the end, he's just contested the Champions League final with Inter Milan. So he's a proper goalkeeper. He's not no novice. And he's very confident at his feet, and that should give Manchester United another dimension. So I think it's a great signing. What do you think?
Absolutely, it just makes sense. There's nothing that I can add to it. I think it makes sense because that's really what Manchester United want. And you're right. I think modern keepers It's almost it's a sweeper role almost that they expect. They've got to have the distribution. If you don't have that, especially at the top level, maybe in the lower regions of the Premier League, maybe you can probably say that's not crucial because you're going to be on the back foot most of the time. But certainly at the top end, that's really what you want. It's almost another asset, attacking asset that you have. So I think you're right. The fact he's played for Ten Hag as well, it bodes well. Ten Hag obviously knows him well, knows his personality, knows his ability. Uh, they might have had a slight falling out, but obviously it's something that wasn't significant enough for Ten Hag to obviously not go for him again. So I think it's a good signing. I think it makes absolute sense, and it makes Manchester United. The question they always say is, does this player make this team better? Yes, it does.
Yeah, I would agree. Just another couple of quick stories. Moises Caicedo. Apparently Chelsea have had a couple of bids rejected around the 70, 75, 80 million mark. Rumour has it that Brighton may well be holding out for 100 million. They will obviously see Caicedo in a similar ilk to that of obviously Declan Rice, where Arsenal have paid 105 million. Do you see that deal getting over the line, Ayub, or do you see, and there was this kind of mooted in some quarters that if Liverpool managed to sell Fabinho and Henderson, both players perhaps leaving for the Saudi Pro League, that they could well engineer a late move for Caicedo. Some of the reporters suggesting that won't be the case, and Chelsea probably have free reign and the inside track on Caicedo. But where do you see? Do you think Chelsea Brighton will get the deal over the line? Tony Bloom, the Brighton owner, he's normally a challenge in terms of getting the better. He's normally good at getting good deals, let's say. So, what are your thoughts on that one?
Uh, he's obviously moving. He's just waiting for the best price. That's all it is. He knows that he's got a player that is in huge demand. So why not? It's simple business, isn't it? Really, you hold on to an asset knowing that they'll keep coming back, keep coming back. There'll be a point in time where maybe when they say, "Well, look, if you don't budge, we're going to move away." Maybe that's the time where we say, "Yeah, okay, well, he's yours." So he'll certainly go. And Chelsea's, I'd be amazed if he doesn't go to Chelsea. I'd be amazed if there is a late bid from any other club. I think Chelsea, it seems to be the destination that he will go to. It's just a case of, I think Brighton are just trying to get the best offer that they possibly can do.
Yeah, I agree, and I do think, yeah, I think they'll get it over the line. Chelsea in the end. I'd be surprised if they kind of turn their noses down on an extra 10, 15 million if they had to, given the way they've spent in recent transfer windows. I think they want the player. Tony Bloom knows well. Listen, I think in the end this player leaves, but he leaves on my terms and on a fee that we agree with. I agree with you. I think it probably gets done with something along the lines of 85 plus realistic add-ons and what have you. So I agree with. I think he does end up at Chelsea, and that would be another amazing signing for Chelsea.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
And I think that will propel them to do well next season, 100%. Last storyline, and again, it's one that we've covered, but it's one that fascinates me. Kylian Mbappe about to sit down, I believe, with the PSG chief, Nasser Al Khalifa. And
No. The PSG chief is sitting down with Mbappe. Get it right.
Whichever way you want to see it, Ayub, but they'll both be
runs the club. You know, Mbappe runs that football club.
They'll both be sat at the same table, so they'll be mutually sitting down together.
No, Mbappe's on his throne.
Mbappe's on his throne. Well, listen, if you're the best player in the world, that's the kind of terms you get to play with. I mean, look, you've got this amazing situation. Normally, the player wants to leave and the club doesn't want to sell, but this is the game of high stakes poker. That is when you're arguably the premier footballer in world football, where he's saying, no, I'll play this last season out. I don't want to leave. And you've got the club say, no, you're going to have to leave because we're not losing you on a free. It's a situation that's been engineered by both parties in the sense of both parties knew what they were doing when they signed the contract. I mean, they were clearly not necessarily trusting one another in the sense that Mbappe ran his previous contract down. So I think in the end, there's not a great deal of sympathy for either party. You are where you are. Both parties will be fine, irrespective of how this ends up. But The interesting thing for me is PSG are saying, look, we're going to sell you to the highest bidder. If you don't commit your future beyond 2024, let's say, or beyond the end of next season, we're going to sell you to the highest bidder. Well, my question to the PSG chief is, who's putting a bid in this summer unless they have Kylian Mbappe on board, that he's happy to go there, because he's simply not going. He may well leave because he may have to leave, but he'll just be like, well, okay, fine, but you buy me at your peril. If I'm not happy to go to this new club, which club's going to actually front up the fee, knowing that the player might not be on board? So are you with me? I mean, in the end, you need a club that's willing to say, well, fine, we'll buy him. PSG clearly wants a fee. Which club's putting up a fee unless Kylian Mbappe is on board? That's my only point. So the point is, Kylian Mbappe next season will play for the team he wants to play for.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Believe you me, it won't be done where they'll just flog him to a team and be like, well, I'm sorry, you go there. It will not happen. So I'm not sure where it works and how it goes. It's the one I just can't work out. If you ask me right now how I see it, I think he plays for PSG next season. And that will be his last season in Paris. What are your thoughts?
I think you touched on, he will play where he wants to play. He knows his position in the game. I don't think he's really fretting. I don't think he's worried. I don't think he's concerned. He will do what he wants, what's best for him. I think it's disappointing in the sense that he's still, I mean, I don't know, how old is he? 22, 23, 24. So he should have moved to a better league. I mean, you know my views on the French league. He should have moved to a better league 2 years ago. So it's a circus, and I think it has become a circus. He's part of the circus. So I'm until it's resolved, I have very little interest in Mbappe and what happens at PSG, because I think, to me, it is ridiculous. A player of that ability is playing in a substandard league, because it is. There is no question about it. The French league it's better than the Scottish league, but not by much.
Where do you think he plays next season?
He will be playing for PSG.
I sense that as well.
Yeah, and it's a source of frustration, because I love football and I love watching players play at the highest level for the best teams. And when I see a player who is the best player in the world playing for PSG, it just doesn't sit with me comfortably at all. I don't know what his primary motivation is. I've got a feeling it's money. And again, that's disappointing. But it is what it is. It is what it is.
I think you need to manage your expectations about footballers in general. That's what I would say. But we digress. I'll let you take it away.
Right, and well, that's it. That's it's an interesting show that we've had today. We've had a very heavy topic, a very serious topic, and one that I'd absolutely love if you were to offer your views, because that's what we want it to be. We want it to be interactive. We want to feed off what you think, what your thoughts are. Okay, so please pop in a comment and do the usual things. Smash a like, share it with your friends. We are getting some traction. We are increasing the number of subscribers. We're obviously trying to put a product out there which is enjoyable, informative, slightly different. That's what we want. We've always sort of said that, right, we're doing a podcast, let's do it slightly different. So we hope it's something that you're enjoying. So your support, as always, is greatly appreciated. So go on, take it away, Owis. What is it? Stay onside. I don't know what it is. Baz, come back. If for nothing else, Baz, just for the final.
You're a disgrace. That's what you are. Well, but again, we are just onside Ayub. But normally Badge would tell our viewers not to stray off.